You know his name. You've heard the stories. But do you really know what happened to the man who had it all? From aviation pioneer to Hollywood titan, Howard Hughes built an empire that few could even imagine. What happened next is a story of obsession, paranoia, and a spectacular descent into darkness. One of the most dramatic collapses of power and fortune America has ever witnessed. Today, we're exploring the fame, fury, and fire that defined the fall of Howard Hughes. When people think of the 1950s and 1960s, they don't often think about Howard Hughes as the central figure, but they should. By the mid-1950s, Hughes was already a living legend. At 25, he'd taken control of his father's tool company and transformed it into a massive defense contractor. At 30, he was breaking world speed records as a test pilot. By 40, he'd already been married and divorced twice, and had bedded some of Hollywood's most glamorous actresses. But wealth? That was always secondary to the real prize: control. Hughes didn't just want money, he wanted power over everything around him. He bought airlines, real estate, casinos. He purchased entire neighborhoods in Las Vegas. When he arrived in Nevada in 1966, he systematically acquired property like a man collecting pieces of a chessboard. The Beverly Hills Hotel, radio stations, a whole slew of casinos including the Sands, the Flamingo, and the Golden Nugget. By 1967, he controlled a piece of nearly everything on the Strip. The aviation division of his empire was legendary. He designed and built aircraft that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The H-1 racer was revolutionary for its time. Later, he worked on the massive Spruce Goose, a flying boat so enormous it was nearly as big as a football field. These weren't vanity projects, these were engineering marvels that pushed the boundaries of what seemed possible. During this era, Hughes was charming, calculated, and completely in command. He could walk into a room and own it. Journalists wanted to interview him. Business titans wanted to deal with him. Women wanted to be with him. He lived in penthouses and bungalows at the Beverly Hills Hotel, moving through Hollywood's social scene like a ghost, present but never quite capturable. Something began to change in the late 1960s. It started subtly, so subtly that at first, only those closest to him noticed. Friends noticed he was becoming more withdrawn. The man who had once been a fixture at Hollywood parties suddenly started declining invitations. The man who had eagerly pursued romantic conquests started withdrawing from women. Phone calls would stretch on for hours, sometimes without a clear purpose or direction. He would call business associates at odd hours, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning, and talk in rambling circles, never quite reaching a point, never quite concluding the conversation. He became obsessed with minor details, with control of every situation. What had once been a charming eccentricity, his need for things to be done in very specific ways, began to take on a different quality, darker, more anxious, more compulsive. Some said it was the medication. Hughes had always taken pills, for pain from old injuries, for energy to fuel his work, for sleep when his mind wouldn't shut down. He was, by most accounts, a fairly heavy pharmaceutical user throughout his adult life. But in the late 60s, his consumption increased dramatically. The pills became more frequent, the dosages became higher. Some blamed the Hollywood lifestyle itself, the constant parties, the endless pursuit of pleasure mixed with the stress of maintaining an image. Others blamed the psychological weight of managing a massive empire, the constant pressure of dealing with politicians and business rivals, the endless negotiations and conflicts that came with his level of wealth and power. Others pointed to a minor airplane crash he'd been in during the late 1960s, suggesting that physical trauma had triggered something deeper, perhaps a latent psychological vulnerability that had been waiting for an excuse to emerge. The crash wasn't fatal, but it was frightening. Hughes walked away from it, but something changed. Whether the crash actually caused the change, or simply coincided with it, remains unclear. The truth is probably more complicated. Likely, it was all of these things combined. The medication, the stress, the trauma, the lifestyle, a perfect storm of circumstance and chemistry and personal vulnerability colliding at precisely the wrong moment. Hughes had always been eccentric. That was part of his charm, part of his mystique. He had his quirks, elaborate business meetings that would go on for 6, 8, 10 hours without break or conclusion. Obsessive attention to detail in his aircraft designs, demanding that engineers and designers redo work dozens of times because it wasn't quite right. Specific preferences about how things should be done, preferences that seemed arbitrary to others but made perfect sense to him. But eccentricity and obsession aren't the same thing. Eccentricity is endearing. It's charming. It's the kind of thing that makes people smile and forgive you for your oddities. Obsession is consuming. It's relentless. It grows and expands and takes over everything. What started as quirks began to transform into something darker. He became paranoid about his health in ways that went beyond normal concern. He was convinced that contamination lurked everywhere, in the air, on surfaces, in the people around him. He would spend hours, sometimes full days, in his darkened bedroom, barely eating, issuing commands through intermediaries who had to relay his words to the outside world. The paranoia was specific. It wasn't generic, floating fear. Hughes wasn't paranoid about money being stolen or business deals falling through. He was paranoid about physical contamination. He became convinced that the air itself was poisoned, that germs were everywhere, invisible but deadly, that people carried infections without knowing it. That casual contact with another human being could result in sickness or death. This fear grew and mutated over time, becoming more elaborate, more specific. He began demanding that his bedroom be sealed off from the rest of the world. Windows were covered with heavy drapes and then sealed with tape. Doors were locked. A single entrance point was established with guards to control who entered. Those who came into his presence had to follow strict protocols: remove your shoes, wear gloves, stand at a specific distance, speak only when spoken to. The isolation wasn't forced upon him. Nobody was keeping him locked away. This wasn't a kidnapping or a confinement imposed by others. He chose it, deliberately, consciously. And with each passing year, he chose it more deeply. It became his preference. It became his comfort. The outside world was terrifying. His room was safe. The outside world was contaminated. His sealed chamber could be kept clean. Each day that passed, the isolation deepened. Nobody could point to a specific moment when something snapped or when a line was crossed. There was no dramatic breaking point. Instead, there was a gradual progression, each decision leading to the next, each choice reinforcing the previous one. It was like watching someone slowly step back from life, one pace at a time, until they were so far removed from normal human existence that return seemed impossible. At what point does someone go too far to come back? Nobody knew. But with Hughes, there was a sense that the answer was approaching. His relationships fractured under the strain. The women who had graced his life, actresses like Jean Peters, models, socialites, women who represented the height of glamour and desirability, found themselves with a man who was becoming increasingly unreliable and distant. He would neglect them for weeks at a time, locked away in his rooms, giving them no explanation. He would make elaborate plans for romantic evenings and then cancel them at the last moment. He would promise things and forget about them entirely, leaving the women confused and hurt. Some moved on to other men, other futures, other possibilities. Some were relieved to escape. They could sense that something was wrong, something was changing, and they didn't want to be trapped in whatever was happening. Others harbored resentment at being abandoned so suddenly and so completely. A very few, spoke fondly of him over the years, remembering the charming, brilliant man he'd been before the walls started closing in. They understood that he was suffering, even if they couldn't quite comprehend what he was suffering from. His family distanced themselves. Hughes had never been particularly close to his relatives. His mother had died when he was in his 20s. His father had been a dominating presence in his early life, but had also died relatively young. He had some cousins and distant relatives, but he'd never cultivated those relationships. Now, as he withdrew from the world, he became actively hostile toward them. He cut off communication. He made it clear that family members were part of the conspiracy he was beginning to imagine, the vague, shadowy conspiracy that seemed to be forming in his mind. His employees grew confused and worried. They didn't know what was happening to their boss. They could see the change, but they couldn't understand it. Instructions became bizarre and contradictory. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Hughes would disappear for days and then suddenly reappear with new demands that made little business sense. The confident, commanding Hughes seemed to be disappearing, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Those who'd known him at his peak, the pilots who'd flown with him, the engineers who'd designed aircraft alongside him, the business associates who'd negotiated deals with him, barely recognized the man he was becoming. It was as if someone was slowly erasing the Hughes they knew, replacing him piece by piece, pixel by pixel, with a stranger. And the tragedy was that Hughes himself seemed to be doing the erasing. He was constructing his own obliteration, brick by brick, decision by decision, isolation by isolation. By the early 1970s, Hughes had vanished from public view almost entirely. Not metaphorically, literally. He stopped attending meetings. He stopped going to parties. He stopped leaving his rooms. The world's greatest living businessman was conducting his vast empire from inside darkened bedrooms, speaking only to a handful of carefully selected employees he called his Mormon Mafia, referring to their religious background and their unwavering loyalty to him. These men became his interface with reality. They were his hands, his feet, his voice in the outside world. They carried messages. They made decisions on his behalf. They controlled who saw him and who didn't. They became gatekeepers to a man who was increasingly unreachable. Some of them genuinely cared about Hughes. Some were simply well-paid employees. All of them were trapped in an increasingly bizarre situation. His headquarters became the Beverly Hills Hotel, then later the Century Plaza, then various other locations. He would rent entire floors, sometimes entire wings of hotels, and seal them off. But wherever he was, the setup was always the same. Locked doors, layers of security, complete isolation from the outside world. Employees had to follow bizarre protocols just to enter his presence. They had to remove their shoes. They had to wear gloves. They had to limit contact with him to specific types of communication. They had to use precise procedures to hand him documents, placing them on surfaces rather than passing them hand to hand. Germs were the enemy. Contamination was everywhere. He became convinced that airborne particles could kill him. He demanded air filters. He had engineers install elaborate ventilation systems in his rooms. He insisted that certain areas be sealed off completely. He would wear masks. He would have his staff wear masks. The bedroom that was supposed to be his sanctuary became a sterile chamber, cold, empty, devoid of human warmth. The control he'd always craved extended into his physical environment with obsessive precision. He would specify exactly how many feet a person should stand from him, sometimes requiring people to remain 10, 15, 20 feet away. He created elaborate procedures for how his food should be prepared. He refused to let anyone touch certain things. His bedroom became a fortress, and he became its prisoner. The barrier between him and the world grew thicker and more impenetrable with each passing month. Staff members would describe the experience of being in his presence as deeply unsettling. A man in a darkened room, giving orders from the shadows, occasionally emerging just enough to be seen but never quite approachable. It was like serving a phantom, someone who was physically present but not quite real. Many employees quit. Those who stayed did so for the money or because they'd become too invested in the situation to leave. The business empire, paradoxically, continued to function. Money kept flowing, investments kept growing. The structure Hughes had built was so solid, so well designed, that it could run without him. Managers managed, decisions were made, contracts were signed. The machinery of his empire ground onward with inhuman efficiency. But Hughes himself seemed to be evaporating, becoming less real, less present, less alive with each passing season. Those who worked for him described a man slowly disappearing into himself, a man who was present but no longer really there. The 1970s and 1980s were a blur of increasingly disturbing behavior. Hughes became convinced of conspiracies. He believed people were trying to poison him. He imagined enemies everywhere. His employees had to be background checked repeatedly. Any new person was viewed with suspicion. He would demand that certain staff members be fired because he'd developed irrational beliefs about them. His appearance deteriorated dramatically. The once handsome billionaire stopped cutting his hair and nails. He refused to bathe regularly. Photographs that emerged showed a skeletal man with long hair and a full beard, looking nothing like the Hughes of old. Isolation had physically transformed him. His drug use spiraled. Codeine became an obsession. He demanded it constantly, convinced that it was the only thing keeping him alive. His doctors obliged him, enabling what would become a serious addiction. The medication didn't help his mental state, it worsened it. He became increasingly detached from reality, his thinking more fragmented, his personality more unstable. He started making bizarre demands that reflected his deteriorating state of mind. He wanted specific items collected. He became obsessed with certain films and would watch them repeatedly. He barricaded himself in even further, creating a living space that more closely resembled a sealed chamber than a hotel suite. The organization he'd built began to show cracks. Without his direct involvement, without his once brilliant decision-making, things started to fall apart. Casinos underperformed. Investments went sour. The machinery of his empire, which had once run with impressive efficiency, began to rust and seize. While Hughes deteriorated behind closed doors, the world changed around him. Technology advanced. Industries transformed. New billionaires emerged. The space age turned into the information age. And yet, Hughes remained frozen in his darkened rooms, a ghost of the 20th century, unable to adapt or engage with the present. The 1970s were a decade of profound change. Vietnam was ending. Watergate shook the nation's faith in its institutions. The oil crisis created economic uncertainty. Music was evolving. Disco was taking over the dance floors. Punk was shaking up rock and roll. Television was becoming a cultural force unlike anything before it. And through it all, Hughes was somewhere behind locked doors, oblivious to most of it, watching old films or obsessing over imagined threats. His airlines and aircraft interests became less relevant as the industry modernized around him. His Las Vegas holdings, once the crown jewels of his empire, began to fade as the casino business evolved in ways he couldn't comprehend from his darkened suite. Other entrepreneurs were building empires, taking risks, making headlines. The torch was passing to a new generation, and Hughes was too far gone to notice. His absence became legendary. Where was Howard Hughes? Nobody knew for certain. There were sightings, rumors really, that kept his name alive in public consciousness. Some claimed to have seen him. Others said he was dead already, his death being covered up. Conspiracy theories flourished because the truth was so strange. People whispered about him in bars and offices. Magazine articles speculated about his whereabouts. The mystery only deepened as the years passed. He'd become a recluse before the internet made such things commonplace. In an era when billionaires still showed their faces and built their legacies through public presence, Hughes did the opposite. He disappeared. The vacuum he left behind filled with speculation, with myth, with the kind of mystique that only complete absence can create. He became less a person and more a legend, a phantom billionaire, a man more rumor than reality. For a man who had built his entire life around control and visibility, the irony was profound. He'd controlled his image so completely by removing himself from view that he'd become unknowable. The power he'd sought had transformed into complete powerlessness. The mystery he'd cultivated had become his prison. In the late 1970s, Hughes attempted to emerge from his isolation. It was brief and ultimately futile. He wanted to reclaim some piece of his old power. He attempted to buy more property. He made some business decisions. But it was clear that something essential had left him. The sharp mind was dulled. The decisive hand had lost its grip. The world had moved on and he could not catch up. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when those around him thought perhaps he might recover. Perhaps with the right medication adjustment, the right doctor, the right intervention, he could return to some semblance of normalcy. But these moments were rare and they never lasted long. Each attempt to bring him back into the world resulted in increased anxiety, deeper paranoia, more desperate demands for isolation. His attempts to engage with business matters were thwarted by his own mental state. He couldn't focus. He couldn't trust his judgment. Documents would arrive for his signature and he'd examine them obsessively, convinced they contained hidden meanings or traps. Phone calls to his executives became rambling, incoherent affairs. He'd issue commands that contradicted previous orders. He'd demand things that made no business sense. The people who worked for him tried to follow his instructions, but they had to interpret them through the lens of his deteriorating sanity. And ultimately, those closest to him, his handlers, his advisors, his employees, took more and more control, managing his affairs while keeping him increasingly isolated and medicated. The keepers had become his caretakers, but also his jailers. They couldn't let him out because they didn't know what he'd do. They couldn't let people in because he'd convinced them everyone was dangerous. They were trapped in a cycle of enabling his isolation while managing the vast machinery of his wealth. The empire that had once been his complete focus became something managed by other people. He watched from the shadows as his own creation operated without him. Reports would come to him, financial summaries, business updates, transaction approvals, but he couldn't process them. He couldn't make sense of numbers anymore. His mind had become like a radio tuned between stations, unable to lock onto anything coherent. The billions continued to flow, but through channels and systems he no longer understood or controlled. By the 1980s, Hughes was barely conscious. He existed in a twilight state, in darkened rooms, barely eating, his body withering. The beautiful, powerful, commanding man had been replaced by a ghost, thin, pale, disconnected from reality. His mind had been ravaged by isolation, paranoia, medication, and his own demons. He moved between locations, Los Angeles, Hawaii, Las Vegas, Mexico, always hidden, always guarded, always behind locked doors. His world had contracted to just a handful of people. His view was limited to four walls. His existence was simply existing, moment after moment, day after day. The isolation that he had chosen, that he had insisted upon, had become his prison. He couldn't leave because the outside world terrified him. He couldn't invite people in because contamination was everywhere. He couldn't stop the medication because his body had become dependent. He couldn't recover because there was nothing to recover into. On April 5, 1976, after years of declining health and complete isolation, Howard Hughes died at age 71. He was in a hospital in Houston after suffering a stroke. His death barely registered in the popular press at first. The man who had once dominated headlines was now barely a footnote. The autopsy revealed needle tracks on his arms, evidence of his drug use and the injections he'd been receiving for years. His body showed the damage of decades of self-imposed isolation and substance abuse. The once vital Hughes Industries, as it had been renamed, fell into chaos. His will was contested. His empire was dismantled piece by piece. What emerged from the wreckage of his life was complicated. Some of his innovations in aviation lived on. The companies he'd founded continued, though without him. But Hughes himself became something else, a cautionary tale, a reminder that absolute power combined with absolute isolation creates absolute destruction. He'd had everything: wealth beyond measure, talent, intelligence, charm, opportunity. He'd built things that endured. He'd loved and been loved, He'd flown planes and broken records, he'd touched Hollywood royalty, he'd owned pieces of cities, and he'd thrown it all away for the cold comfort of control, for the false safety of isolation, for the illusion of protection that paranoia provides. When you look at Hughes's life, you see the arc of ambition in its purest form. The brilliance, the drive, the willingness to pursue dreams that others thought impossible. All of it was genuine. He wasn't a villain. He wasn't evil. He was simply a man whose talents, his money, and his psychological vulnerabilities collided in a way that created tragedy. The mansion of power he'd built became a prison. The control he'd craved became his captor. The isolation he'd chosen became his tomb, a tomb he visited every single day while still alive. What makes Hughes's story resonate, particularly for those who remember his era, is the sense of waste. Not waste of money, though billions were squandered. Waste of potential. Waste of years. Waste of a life that could have meant something more than this. He died before the age of modern celebrity documentation, before every moment could be captured, before the internet would have dissected his every move. He managed to preserve some mystery, some privacy, through his obsessive seclusion. But at what cost? Hughes left behind aircraft designs that influenced aviation for decades. He left behind a media legacy of mystery and mystique. He left behind billions in his estate. But he also left behind a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked wealth, unchecked isolation, and unchecked paranoia. For those of us who watched his rise, his era was unforgettable. For those of us who witnessed his fall, the lesson remains clear. No amount of money can buy peace. No amount of power can create security. And no amount of isolation can protect you from yourself. The story of Howard Hughes is a story of ambition, brilliance, and tragedy. It's a story that reminds us that the biggest fortunes can crumble, that the most powerful people can become the most vulnerable, that sometimes the greatest prison we build is one we construct for ourselves. That is the story of fame, fury, and fire, the fall of Howard Hughes. If you've enjoyed exploring this fascinating chapter of American history, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of remarkable lives and the legacies they left behind. We release new videos every week, so you won't want to miss what comes next. Thank you for watching.